Next thing we're going to do is pave the way for our keynote speaker, Dave Bedini, award-winning author and musician, globally recognized entrepreneur, and the only person to have been nominated for a Gemini, a Genie, and a Juno Award, a founding member of the Rheostatics, and a true icon in the world of media. With great pleasure, Dave Bedini.
I never knew Kevin Kennedy was such a communist. He likes all teams now. I knew him when he was dyed in the wool. I also knew him before he had a man bun, although I was getting more of a ponytail. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming out. This is a great event. I don't really know what it is, but I'm going to actually do a little bit of stand-up comedy. So you guys are media people, right, or media connoisseurs, media students, but how many are actually like writers here in the crowd? Okay, so about a good number. I've been writing ever since I was 11 years old. I had a poem published in the Toronto Sun. The Toronto Sun used to have a section called the Young Sun, where they would run things that kids wrote, right? And I wrote a poem about an old hockey player. We did this talk to a Montessori class, and I told that story, and some kid who was like 8 put up their hands and said, was it Doug Gilmour? It wasn't Doug Gilmour, it was a hockey player named Eddie Shack. Anyways, I wrote this poem. My parents goaded me to write this poem. I guess they saw me as kind of an emerging poet when I was young, but I'm not a poet. But anyways, I wrote this poem, and it was in the Young Sun, and it was so amazing to have, something I thought up in my imagination on the printed page, and I thought that was the greatest thing in the world. But then they sent me a letter saying that they were going to give me a free T-shirt because I'd had my poem published in the Young Sun, and I got my T-shirt, and it still is kind of the greatest day of my life. And I figured that, by writing, if you wrote and it meant that you got free T-shirts, I thought, well, this is totally the career path upon which I want to go down. So that was pretty great. Got my T-shirt, and then kept writing a little bit more. And I wrote for punk magazines and new wave magazines when I was a teenager, and then, as in now, it was actually easy in a way to have your stuff published at a certain level, right? So I did that for a while. I've played in a band. It'll be 40 years in 2 years, a band called the Rheostatics. We've been around for a long time. And so I was touring a lot and playing a lot. So I was kind of getting a lot of stories from being on the road. And I ended up writing a tour diary for the Toronto Sun about touring across the country in 1994, opening for the Tragically Hip on one of their tours. So I wrote about being on the road, and being on the road in Canada is kind of like adventure travel, right? Especially if you travel in the wintertime. Van breakdowns and lots of, cutting through this impossible country and impossible landscape and getting from coast to coast. So I wrote about that, and then it ended up becoming a book, which was my first book for McClelland and Stewart, called On a Cold Road. And what I did is I wrote about playing arenas for the first time. Actually, Bare Naked Ladies are getting inducted into the Juno Hall of Fame this weekend. And the first time we ever played in a giant arena, we played at Pacific Coliseum in Vancouver, British Columbia. And we were so nervous, we were like vomit nervous, going to play in front of thousands of people, more people than we've ever played before in our lives. And we had it all set up, like our guitar player, our drummer would go out first and he'd play a little drum pattern. Then the guitar player would come out and play a little guitar pattern, and then we would all emerge on stage and we'd play our first song, and it would go over. It would be it would be wildly successful, and people would go crazy, and it'd be the greatest thing anyone had ever heard. And so it was all dark on stage, and there were 16,000 people in the rink. And as our drummer bounded out on stage to go to his drum kit, he accidentally shut off our guitar player's amp and pedal network. So he got out there to play, and it was complete silence. So that was one of those examples of one of those adventure stories I had while on tour. The Star ran this thing. I ended up having this book published, and it was kind of through that, I think, that I was drawn to just the power of storytelling, right? Not only the power of storytelling, but the power of, I guess, my storytelling, or the power of a story that one is generated through an experience in their life. And I think that's the thing that I always want to tell the people who really create anything or want to create anything for, as a living, as a livelihood, that all of our stories are important because they're our stories, right? And everybody who looks out into the world, who goes out into the world, the things that they pull back that have any value is because it's cut through a prism of one's own experience. So everyone is singular and everyone has a singular voice. And really the trick is being able to make sure that voice comes through as clearly and as honestly and as fearlessly in what you create as art. So, I don't think one is inherently born with the kind of fearlessness that one needs to be a writer and a creator. But I would say everybody here is kind of ahead of the game because you're doing it, because you are telling these stories, and because you feel good enough about what you do to express how you feel in the very depths of your soul. And that's so already, I would say everybody here is kind of ahead of the game. Now, I mean, the question, I'm sure it's been discussed today and it'll be discussed tonight, is what you do with that and how you get to express yourself to as many people as possible, as clearly as possible. And I'm here to tell you that the way to do that is to start a newspaper. That's not entirely true. But I did start a newspaper, which is one of the reasons I think people invited me here to talk. So my 13th book is coming out in the fall on Penguin Random House. I've written 12 others. But my next one is based on an experience that kind of leads to how I came up with the idea of starting a newspaper. So I'll just talk a little bit about that, and then I'll talk about the paper, and then we'll talk about other stuff. But I wrote for the National Post for 3 years. I was a columnist in the Saturday paper. I'm going to talk a little bit about this tonight, so if I repeat stuff tonight, it'll be okay. But I hope to not tread over the same territory, but I might. Michael Jackson died, and the editor of the National Post called me up and asked if I would write an obituary about Michael Jackson. And I don't know, I didn't know that people took me for a Michael Jackson aficionado or fan or whatever, even though I was not a fan. I mean, I loved him, he was awesome, but I was sort of surprised that they called me. Nonetheless, they called me. And so they asked if they could have 800 words by 9 o'clock that night so they could run in the paper the next day. I didn't really think I could do it because, I wasn't kind of feeling any kind of, wasn't feeling driven, certainly not emotionally by by him passing. But anyways, I sat down and I wrote, and I came up with 800 words, and I sent it to the Post, and they said they thought it was good. And then when I went to the corner store the next day to buy the newspaper, it was on the front page of the Post, and they did a beautiful job of it and stuff too. So because of that, they asked if I would write a column for the Post, and I said I would write for them on only one condition, and the condition was they let me do whatever I wanted to do, which is usually when you make that kind of ask of someone, that usually results in the phone being hung up. But they didn't hang up the phone. They said they wanted to follow me down this path to try to do some different things, I guess, writing for a national newspaper. So it was great. It was a beautiful 3 years. I was able to write whatever I wanted to write, and they would publish it. I mean, they would edit it and make sure it made sense and stuff too, but generally they let me do a lot of cool stuff. They let me do, I wrote a column about Stephen Harper where I auto-tuned his thoughts. I would write long, unbroken paragraphs about stuff, and would write a lot about my own experiences traveling and being in the world. So that was great, and then things got kind of weird there, like a lot of mainstream media has become weird. A lot of goofy business decisions and stuff, ownership shifting, and the whole change in the media scape, as it were. And newspapers really, traditional mainstream newspapers, and I think you see this now, instead of really trying to do what they did really well and make a really, really great newspaper, they asked themselves how they could transfer what they did online and make a great digital facsimile or version of what they did as a three-dimensional newspaper, which is a bit of a mug's game. And I think on a lot of counts, with a few exceptions, many have failed. So the National Post, what they did is they actually took the arts editor Ben Arrett, who was the person who commissioned my column, and moved him to a tablet. They were gonna create a National Post tablet version of the newspaper. So I lost my arts editor. I was replaced by a far less sympathetic editor, and they started to create this the tablet version of the paper, which never saw the light of day. It was like an 18-month project. Ben was working there. Ben ended up leaving the National Post. They ended up putting a bullet into the tablet, and so you could see my column kind of free falling because I didn't have support there. Anyways, eventually, they called me into the office and they told me they wanted to limit my column in word count, and they wanted to vet all the ideas behind the column through a management, basically through a team at the Post. So I could no longer really do what I thought made the column work. So I was kind of out of a gig, and my last year at the National Post, I was invited to Yellowknife to read at the Northwards Literary Festival in Yellowknife. And has anybody here ever been to Yellowknife, or is anybody here from Yellowknife-ish? It's Yellowknife is a wild place. It's way far up in the Northwest Territories, and a lot of people kind of end up running to Yellowknife, escaping their lives down south. So everybody has an incredible narrative. It's also Dene Nation in the Northwest Territories, and the entire NWT government is 100% Dene. So there's a really strong, pronounced indigenous culture, which is very easy to love, and it's easy to know. And so it's a really interesting town that way. So you have all these people from down south with these wild stories of their former lives, and then you have this really rich Dene culture. And the literary festival was one of the weirdest I'd ever read at. There were only 4 invited published authors who went up to that festival. The rest were just locals who were telling stories about encounters with polar bears, about being out on a snowmobile on the tundra, and having to relieve themselves on the tundra, and just normal people telling stories. So it was a really refreshing, I loved my time there. And there's a place there called the Gold Range, which is the old miners' tavern where everybody drinks. And I went there on my last night, and the dance floor was incredible because you had this collision of people who work for the government, straight white dudes who work for the government. You had there was a stagette. There was 14 young indigenous women dressed like Laverne and Shirley in these kind of Fonzie jackets. They were having a stag. There were dudes with no teeth. There were the band was playing, and it was a band from Kelowna, British Columbia, called Colt 45. They had a singing drummer. And they started doing a Creedence Clearwater Revival medley. So we all got on the dance floor and we were all dancing. And my friend tapped me on the shoulder and said, turn around, but don't stare. So it's so hard to do, right? So I turned around and totally stared. But it was 4 or 5 young indigenous men and women who had ancestral indigenous writing tattooed on their face, which is part of a tradition that young indigenous kids are starting to do up in the Northwest Territories. But I just thought to myself, I knew I could be nowhere in Canada other than Yellowknife. And so I came back, got booted from the Post, and was thinking what I was going to do with my life in newspapers, because I loved writing for the Post. I loved the response I had from people there, and I loved what the column was. And I thought, well, how can I get back to Yellowknife? And then I realized while I was there, I was reading the city newspaper, the Yellowknifer. And the Yellowknifer comes out twice a week. It's still sold by kids on street corners. So it's still sold out of newspaper bags Wednesday and Friday. It costs $1. Kids get 25 cents for every copy of the paper they sell. There's 2 absolutes at the Yellowknifer, and this was started when they formed in 1973. One was no international news. So for instance, when my friend who was a reporter there told me that when Robin Williams died, he really wanted to write about Robin Williams, the comedian, but he didn't know how because there was no Yellowknife connection. Then he found somebody in Yellowknife named Robin Williams, so that was the way he ended up writing about that. They didn't even write about the Twin Towers. They didn't even write about 9/11 because it happened somewhere other than Yellowknife. So that's one of their absolutes. The other absolute is they use no wire copy whatsoever. It's only writing generated by local writers, so people who are on reporters' row there. They have 14 reporters they employ full-time, and editors and copy editors and managers and that kind of thing. But it was still a really important and vital media vessel for this town. People still read it to find out stuff that happened to their neighbor, or why that place was on fire, or why that houseboat had moved. And then really, in Yellowknife and the Northwest Territories, the internet totally sucks. So it's not that like people could get their news information doing that. They had to actually read the newspaper. So I called them up and asked if I could write for them. And they said, of course, why would you want to do that? And I told them that I thought their paper was great. And they just said, sure, come on up. So my publisher at McClellan and Stewart Penguin Random House thought it would be a great idea, a great way of writing about the North through an experience at a newspaper. And I had a great time. While I was there, this one dude named John McFadden, he was a reporter in Toronto. He worked at City TV. He worked for the Sun News Network. He worked for the CBC. Burned every bridge in Toronto. His last chance to work in media was in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. So he ended up there, and he was I couldn't have invented really a better character. A hard-drinking, hard-boiled, an inveterate, not a womanizer, but he slept with everybody, and and like bad relationships too. And this is in Yellowknife, a small town, so he was a bit of a legend when I was there, anyways. But he was also a legend for more valuable reasons too. One of which he brought a big city attitude of writing and reporting to a small place. So, for instance, the Yellowknife RCMP is distinct in the sense that, there's no local police force. The only capital city in Canada with no local police force is just the RCMP. And the RCMP in the North, they hide a lot of bad cops. So it's a very, very fragile relationship between the town and the cops. And so when he was there, he found out that one of the things, for instance, when a sexual predator would be released from the jail, the RCMP would not notify the public. And he thought, his theory was that they were using people like this as bait to try them on more involved in greater charges. So he held the RCMP's feet to the fire and said, you must change policy, you must announce when these people have been released into the public. And there was, they went to war over this, and he ended up writing about this in the Yellowknifer, and the RCMP barred him from press conferences, and there was a real battle between the two of them. Well, at the end of the day, the RCMP, of course, changed the policy because he brought this to light in the Yellowknifer. So he was a pretty great reporter. Like, he would, nearly killed me being up there because he would stay out till 5 o'clock in the morning. He would finish every night at the local strip bar, Harley's. And but he was a great guy to kind of ride side saddle with. And I would go out with him and cover chemical spills, and I would cover triple murders. And I got a really true sense of the story through his experiences. While I was there, the RCMP arrested him for obstruction of justice. And that's the big narrative of the book that's coming out next fall. So the back half of my book ended up being the trial, and the trial really pitted the cops against the newspaper. And really it was kind of it's a theme or it's a narrative that could have existed in the 1950s, but it was happening in 2017 in Canada. So that's the scope of that book, and that's the scope of those experiences. So I came back and I wrote the book and submitted it, and I realized that I didn't have half as much fun writing the book. I mean, writing isn't fun anyways, let's face it, right? But I didn't have as much fun putting that together as I did actually working for the Yellowknifer. I loved experiencing, and I'd never worked as a reporter before. I was always writing books, and I was a bit of a music writer, I suppose, and a lyricist, and a columnist. So I was never a true reporter. Reporting's fucking hard, and that was really brought to light through my experiences with him. So anyways, I thought, when I was back in Toronto, I thought, like, what can I do next? And I think as writers, you kind of always have, and Kevin mentioned this earlier, you always kind of have to think a little bit about where you're headed next. You always have to be really, really deep in the well of creativity, but you also have to keep your antenna up. Because once one work is done, you're always defined by what you've done last, right? So I was thinking about newspapers, and as I was writing this book, the entire traditional mainstream newspaper colossus was folding in on itself. You know, every second day there would be news about, you know, shrinking newsrooms, and it's still happening, right? So I thought, what can I do, you know? And I think as writers and as artists and as creators, it's a tough life, but you are allowed a certain freedom throughout the 2 minutes. You are allowed a certain freedom. I haven't even come to my thesis yet. Sorry, I'm appearing tonight too. It's like 2 shows. This is huge. It's a 2-show day. But I thought, you know, as creators, you have a chance. We have the ability to dream, right? We're not chained, you know, to our lives, and that's, I think, the real currency that we have. So I dreamt a newspaper, and the newspaper is the West End Phoenix. And I brought a bunch of copies here, but I didn't bring nearly enough, because you never know when you're invited to these things whether it's going to be 7.5 people sitting in like a small room or whether it's going to be a beautiful theater like this. But I'll bring more tonight too. So the West End Phoenix is a subscription-driven, patron-supported, ad-free, non-profit community newspaper for the West End. And we employ lots of people, over 100 illustrators, photographers, and writers over the course of our 5 issues. And we home deliver the newspaper. So if you're freaked out by somebody coming on your porch, dropping something in your mailbox, don't subscribe. But if you like to have the newspaper show up and read about that weird fire down the street, or why hasn't that dude moved his old car, or there's bigger issues than that. I'm kind of being self-effacing here. We tackle, I mean, the West End is it's a place in transformation. Our whole city is a place in transformation. We emphasize Indigenous writers, people of color, the diaspora. We try to give everybody a chance to write for the first time. We have a lot of new voices, and I think it's really good. And there's a whole bit about the struggle to maintain it and to make it a viable model, a commercial model, but that's all boring stuff. And I can tell you about that in private, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit about it tonight, but I guess what I'm saying is we dreamt it and we did it, and you can too. Cheers. I know you're going to ask me a bunch of questions, but they're not your questions.
They're not.
You're merely the Confederate.
As for the rest of our questions, we also have the Slido app, but everyone is welcome to come take the mic from me if they're interested. That is still open. If not, I will be reading the Slido questions. And a lot of the questions are going to come from anonymous, I think, eh? Very curious mind, that anonymous person. So you're able to see the questions as well on the monitor, but we'll start now with our first question. What career mistake has been your biggest lesson in your journey through all the different media you've done? Mistake. Wow. A lot of mistakes. I always say that you kind of got to love your garbage, you know, like you got to love your mistakes, because they're a big part of creativity, right? My wife always says as well, is like, she always says, another good thing to think about is the reader never knows what you took out, which I think is kind of a good thing too. Biggest career mistake was, I think, being invited to the Emerge Festival to have to answer that question. Thank you for your honesty. You're welcome. Our next most popular question is, what are options for communities that have been left without papers due to recent closures? We decided to become a nonprofit, patron-supported, subscription-supported newspaper because I think it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a blind alley pursuing advertisers. So we just figured that people in the community would want to support the paper because it was for them, and I think that's one model potentially for newspapers being revived in all the communities that have lost them recently. I hope so, anyways. So, yeah. Do you have any advice for people with their own stories that they want to get inside of that kind of industry in that lane? In what sense? What do you mean? So you've went ahead and started your own paper. Yeah. And I'm sure many people out there want to make their own, not necessarily newspaper, but their own creation, become their own boss, become the content creator and the person putting all this information out. How did you go about it? And you said a little bit, but kind of how would you recommend someone go about starting their own path in that way?
Well, we're all our own worst enemies, right? I mean, everybody has that voice telling them that what they're doing is shit and you're no good. That's part of the whole creative process. I mean, it's so there's a lot of anxiety, and self-doubt is a big part of art, I think, too. But, and it's easy for me to say, just do it, because it's hard. But just do it, I guess. I mean, I think, listen, if you don't tell your story, nobody's going to tell your story. Like, it's up to you. It's valuable to us to have your view of the world reflected into the world. That's what makes writing and storytelling interesting. And, really all you have to do is start. But I will say, though, one of the things I learned being in a band is it's great to have a group. And one of the things that's great about paper as well is there's a team and there's a group. And it's tough. It is tough to do it yourself. So find a friend. Or even invite an enemy to become your friend. That's even better. I also will say, too, like, revenge is a huge motivating factor for doing stuff as well. Like, I could tell stories forever, but it's good you need something to kind of grind against a little bit. And if you really feel that what you have to say is valuable, then you can do it. In terms of the schematic of how you go about doing that, I mean, there's a lot of different ways. Yeah.
So you've talked a little bit about having something to grind against, but
Yeah.
what was the hardest part about starting a newspaper, and what was that biggest challenge, that biggest obstacle, that thing you needed to kind of sort of grind past?
I mean, I was doing stuff I'd never done before, and that main thing was I was asking people for money, basically. And I did ground level. Like, I knocked on doors. We did door-to-door campaigning for months. Like, I would show up at people's doorsteps, and I would see people peek through the drapes. And then, like, I would hear the feet move to the back of the house, and you could see the lights shut off. I do that, too. Hi, Riley. There's Riley. She's our co-op student working for the West End Phoenix. Awesome. Anyways, yeah, so I just went, I tried to not be annoying. I tried to not ask too much of the people that came to the door. And we did this all without a newspaper for the first 4 or 5 months. So people would open the door and I would say, hey, I'm Dave. I live near you. And I want to start a newspaper. And I would give them a fridge magnet. And then if I was lucky, I would go home and see that they had subscribed to the paper. So that was the hardest. That was the hardest, because that was like, walking's tiring. And talking to people can be a kind of a drag sometimes. It can be awesome too, you never know. So that's hard, but also for us, like, keeping coal, continuing to, like, shovel coal into the hearth to keep us moving is the toughest thing. And for me, that's about also talking to patrons. Yeah, a lot of coffee with people who may or may not give us money to keep the paper going and stuff too. So disappointment is a huge part of the game, right?
Thank you. We have a question from John Patty.
All right, John.
Your publication has a huge artistic and illustrative presence. What led you to make that stylistic choice? And you've led quite an artistic life yourself with being in a band and now the newspaper. Yeah. Can you tell us maybe a story of how you went from music to written word and how
I don't think that's the question.
You're
editorializing.
2 questions in one. I mean, I've invited them to come down to the mic.
Hey, nobody said anything about 2-in-1 questions, man.
All right, we'll start with John's question, and then I'll sneak mine in.
Okay, we'll back end it. So it's the pages here. Here's one. I'm just going to hold it up. Look, it's show and tell. It's so it's a giant paper. Let's try to get to the that's 30 inches across. So papers are. Thank you. Papers are like narrowing and thinning. We just wanted to make it really big, but we wanted to make it really big to answer that question because photographs look so great when they're big, and illustrations look amazing when they're big. And we're used to seeing our stuff on a little tiny square. We just wanted to blow the fuck up. We wanted to make it huge. And when we went to our printer, we said, could you do a 30-inch newspaper? And they're like, yeah, we do that all the time. So they do it like the Urdu Times is 30 inches. And I came across a copy of that when I was at the King's Palace there on Yonge Street. And I realized that kind of paper does still exist. So that's part of it. And what was your question? Oh, I forgot. No, what was it? Artistic. Yeah, art is the same. Whether you're a carpenter, whether you're a painter, whether you're a stock car driver, all of that passion comes from the same place. They're all cousins, those art forms, I think.
So
Totally.
being in a band and making music all sort of relates to making a creative newspaper with an artistic presence.
Right.
It all goes together?
I think partly, when you're on stage, like I'm on stage now, and I'm sure other people here have been on stage before, it's like once you get used to kind of having that microphone in your hand or having that third wall, I don't know, I always get confused if it's the third or fifth wall. Anyways, once that wall is taken away, you become a lot more sort of empowered to express yourself, and that's part of how it was driven, I think.
Awesome. We now have a question from Warren from the audience. Our
Warren,
first
right
audience
on.
question coming down. Give him a round of applause.
All right, Warren, come on down. Oh, there he is.
Sorry, I figured nobody was using the microphone. Somebody should do that. So I noticed you mentioned you were talking about the importance of incorporating Indigenous voices and people of color. I also really dig the shirt, by the way.
Thank you.
What's the role for us as emerging media professionals in continuing those works towards reconciliation and making a better community for us all?
Yeah, I think it's just, listen, I think it's almost as simple as like there's so many great stories in our community that haven't been told because the stories have largely been told by the same 12 people over the last 50 years, really. So just for the sake of storytelling, and I think for the sake of great art, we need to tell stories that people haven't heard before. It's like, that's why art is so interesting because you'll come across a melody or you'll come across a way of painting that will appeal to you because it's different. And I think we're at a point now where we need to bring in different voices that are powerful and great because they are different and new. Cheers. Thanks, Warren.
Thanks
Well
again
done.
to Warren. Let's give him a round of applause.
Right on, Warren. Warren came down. He's going to get the door prize. Totally.
And then we're going to go with our final question of this
Okay.
question period, which is what is success to you and your path and your terms? What is success to you? That's kind of our theme of the day, so we'd love to hear your perspective.
Really, success is just, being able to create, for another day. That's success. I think Tom Petty said that success is defined by paying the rent by doing something you love. So I think that's part of it as well. But just to keep moving, that's success. To keep moving, keep producing, keep doing what you're doing. Not every day are you going to create something that's going to be of value. In fact, it's probably the opposite. But as long as you keep doing it, that's the main thing. One of the first things a musician told me, our first gig in 1980, musician told, we went as a young band, when I was 17, we asked this guy, what's the secret to success? And he said, never break up. And he was bullshitting us, I'm sure. He was feeding us a line, but it was kind of true. And I think one of the ways of redefining that is just don't give up, right? Just keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. You never know.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. Thank you very much for everything you've
Thanks,
said.
guys.
This is the question and answers.